All right, to wrap up our module 15, we're going to be in 15.6/7, properties of quadrilaterals. We'll see all the different ones we're going to be focused on with that. So our essential question is, what conditions are needed to have a parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, or square? So we're going to be focusing on what those conditions are. All right, so first one we're going to look at is properties of parallelograms. So we know that opposite sides of a parallelogram are parallel. Hence the name parallelogram. And then we also know that opposite angles are congruent. Okay, so parallel is these lines here. So those two sides are parallel. Those two sides are parallel. That's what the arrows mean. And then opposite angles are congruent. So A is congruent to C, and D is congruent to B. All right, and then diagonals bisect each other. So remember, bisect means they cut them in half. So then that segment is congruent to that segment, and that segment is congruent to that segment. Now, using properties of parallelograms, so we have our something about sides and then something about angles. So opposite sides are parallel, congruent. So let me add that up here as well. So if we know they're congruent, we can then write 5x plus 19 equals 7x. So then we can subtract 5x. And we get 19 equals 2x divided by 2. And we get x equals 19 over 2. Substitute that value back in. So I'm going to just substitute in for 7 here. So 7 times 19 over 2. And since we are talking about a distance, we normally don't put those in fractions, so we would write that as 66.5. Now for our angle, we know that opposite angles are congruent as well, so then I can set 6y plus 5 equal to 8y minus 17. Subtract 6y. And I get 5. Let's do this. So I get 2y here. And go ahead and add 17. And we get 22. Divide by 2. And y equals 11. Substitute back into one of those. So substitute in for. All right, so substituting for 6y plus 5, so I get 6 times 11 plus 5, and 6 times 11 is 66, plus 5 is 71, so I get 71 degrees there, which makes this 71 degrees here. All right, so 5, suppose you wanted to find the measures of other angles of the parallelogram A, B, C. D, explain your steps. So go and take a minute and figure this out. And so what we have is our parallelogram. I know that angle is 71 and that angle is 71. But since it is a parallelogram, we know that side is parallel to that side. And we have our transversal right there, which means these two angles, so B and D, are same side interior, which means 71 plus measure of angle B has to equal 180. Subtract that 71, and measure of angle B equals 109. So this is 109, and then we know that opposite angles are congruent, so this one down here, angle A, is 109 as well. Oh, sorry. This is angle C up here. All right, so I want you to work on 6, 7, and 8, see if you can find them each measure of QR and PR, and then reflect on given parallelogram JKLM. What are the congruent segments and angles? And don't forget our diagonals as well. All right, so jumping into some other properties here of more specific types of polygons, quadrilaterals, parallelograms. So specifically we're talking about rectangles, so we know opposite sides are parallel. We also know opposite sides are congruent. So I can put that mark as well. Then we know that all angles are congruent, which means they all have 90 degrees, so 90, 90, 90. And 90 consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, meaning they add up to 180, so we already saw that with the parallelogram. Since they're both 91, it's pretty straightforward, 90 plus 90. And then diagonals bisect each other, just like they did in parallelograms. And diagonals are actually congruent. So one of the big things that distinguish a rectangle from a parallelogram is our diagonals, not only do they bisect each other, but they are congruent as well. All right, elaborate. Explain why this is a true condition for rectangles. If one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. So let's take a look at it. So if this is 90, and we know it's a parallelogram, and so we know that same side interior, okay, or consecutive angles are supplementary. So if this is 90, this one has to be 90. And then going from F to G, F is 90, then G is a consecutive angle, so they have to add up to 180, so that has to be 90 as well. And then G to H, applying the same principle, that becomes 90 as well. And so a parallelogram that has 4 angles that are 90 degrees is a rectangle. All right, so a little deep thought. We'll talk about squares here in a little bit. So a deep thought is all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Let that sink in, maybe mess with your mind a little bit. Have a good weekend thinking about that. All right, a rhombus. So in a rhombus, opposite sides are parallel. Now, slight difference, instead of opposite sides being congruent, all sides are congruent. And then opposite angles are congruent. That 90 degrees is not true. There's a typo there. So again, opposite angles. So as we look at F is congruent to H, E is congruent to G, but not necessarily right angles are 90 degrees. Consecutive angles are supplementary. Diagonals bisect each other. And then here's a big difference for a rhombus is diagonals are perpendicular. So they intersect at that 90 degrees, and that would be true all the way around. And then diagonals bisect the opposite angle as well. So you can see that over here. EHF is congruent to GHF. So rhombus adds a couple new things. In particular, diagonals are perpendicular and diagonals bisect the opposite angle. All right, jump into our last shape. So properties of squares. So opposite sides are parallel. And then a square, all sides are congruent and all angles are congruent, maybe 90 degrees. Consecutive angles are supplementary then. Because 90 plus 90 is 180. Diagonals bisect each other. Diagonals are perpendicular. Diagonals bisect opposite angles. And diagonals are congruent. So you can see a square basically took all the properties of the previous ones and gets it all thrown in. So a square is a rhombus, a square is a rectangle, a square as a parallelogram. All of those get thrown in together. All right, so let's take a look at some examples here. So number 10, so as we look at that, so all sides are congruent, which means it can either be a rhombus or a square. But since we have our right angles in all of them, that is what distinguishes it to be a square. And as we look at 11, we now have all sides are congruent, but you look, the angles are not marked as 90 degrees. So then this would be our rhombus. Okay, 12, we have opposite sides are congruent. Well, that's all we know, so we don't have right angles. Not all sides are congruent, so it's not a square or a rhombus, so it'd only be a rectangle or a parallelogram. Since our angles are not 90 degrees, we then have a parallelogram. And last one, like number 12, 13 has opposite sides that are congruent, so we know it's now not a rhombus or a square. We do have right angles, so we know it's on a parallelogram, which leaves it as a rectangle. All right, so 14 and 15, we're told what type of shape it is, but we then need to use the properties so that we can find the value that would make it that type of parallelogram true. So a square, we're pointing to our bisect angle in the middle. In a square, remember that is 90 degrees. So then if that were a square, we could say that 3x plus 12 equals 90. Subtract 12 and 3x equals 78, divide by 3, and x equals 26. All right, then a rhombus here. We know if it's to be a rhombus that all sides are congruent, so this would be congruent to that, which means we can write 14 minus x equals 2x plus 5. I'm going to add x here. We get 3x. Subtract 5. And we get 9, divide by 3, and x equals 3. Good. And essential question again, what conditions are needed to have a parallelogram, a rectangle, rhombus, or a square? So as you can see, there's quite a few of them, but they all kind of build on each other. So just understand which ones go with what. Squares are going to have the most. And I will do some work with this as well. And even in solving these types of problems, knowing the properties is what makes it most beneficial. Okay, so your assignment is up at the top. Do not forget to complete that assignment. There will be a homework check for 15.6, 15.7 though.